Hello, and thank you for joining today's Environment and Energy Leader webinar titled Flammable Liquid Storage, Simple Solutions for Your Burning Questions, sponsored by J.J. Keller and Associates. My name is Jessica Hunt, and I am the Director of Live Events for E&E Leader. Before I hand the presentation over to our speakers, I do want to go over a few housekeeping items with attendees. Hopefully I can get through this quick intro without my dogs barking. First and foremost, thank you for being on with us wherever you are in the world today. In case you are unable to join us live, this event will be available on demand by Wednesday evening. If you are having any technical issues, please troubleshoot first using the help widget at the bottom of your console. And in case you need additional assistance, please send a message to me using the Q&A widget. Attendees do have the ability to chat with each other during the event as well. To utilize the attendee chat feature, you may have to double-click on Enter Your Message. There will be a few poll questions throughout today's event. If your slide does not advance, please just hit the refresh button. And I am so pleased today to welcome Ray Chishti and Travis Roden from J.J. Keller and Associates. Both are editors in the EHS space and bring with them a wealth of knowledge that they will be sharing with all attendees today and those who will be watching this on demand. If by chance you have questions throughout the presentation, please just submit them and we will do our best to get to them before the end of today's event. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Ray and Travis.
All right, terrific. Thank you very much, Jess, for having us, and all of our attendees. Thank you for attending. So today's webcast is brought to you by J.J. Keller Safety Management Suite. The Safety Management Suite streamlines compliance at every level of your business, making it easy to develop, implement, and maintain an industry-specific safety program in your workplace. And because your success is our priority, today's attendees will be offered complimentary access to our compliance tools and resources in the Safety Management Suite. Again, on behalf of our sponsor and J.J. Keller, thank you for joining us today. Some agenda items that we're going to be covering today. Certainly flammable liquids is covered by the OSHA regulation 1910-106. We'll be covering that today and be talking about how it applies in your workplace. You probably have lots of different types of storage situations in your working environment, and we'll discuss some of the most common ones. There's also a few OSHA regulations that will dabble down into what we call burning questions, and we'll answer some of those popular Q&As. We're also going to be talking about employee training considerations. So what are some things that you should be thinking about in terms of initial training, awareness training, periodic training in your workplace if you have flammable liquids in your workplace. Also, we'll be talking about specific criteria for flammable liquid storage. Things like if you have flammable liquids inside. So if you have an indoor storage situation, we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about storing flammable liquids in flammable storage cabinets, which is typically the most popular way to store flammable liquids and across industries. We'll also be talking about unique situations. So if you have an office or if you have an outdoor storage area or maybe even a basement, we'll be talking about what are some of the flammable liquid storage requirements for those scenarios. Also, you'll hear us frequently refer to, making sure that you check your local fire and building code. As I mentioned, 1910-106, we'll talk about the safety requirements from an OSHA lens, but you're also going to find that your local fire and building codes are going to have similar or more stringent requirements that you'll have to follow. So we'll be talking about that as well. So up here on your screen, you'll see a little poll. I'd like to find out a little bit more about you and what you hope to learn today. So if you go ahead and select, what is your biggest challenge with flammable liquids in your workplace? And then we can kind of look and see where we are at as attendees. So, thinking through this, what is your biggest challenge Do you have an indoor situation? Do you store your liquids outdoors? Are you wondering about the different limits or maybe categories of flammable liquids? Feel free to tell us your biggest challenge in that Q&A box. So you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and Travis and I will be answering your questions as we go through today's webcast. And let's see where we're at here. So we got a little bit more than half who are dealing with indoor storage issues. We have about almost a quarter dealing with knowing allowable limits of flammable liquids. We have a few situations, so 8.7% identifying all flammable liquids in the workplace. We'll be covering that as well. Flammable liquid handling requirements, and even 8.7 in outdoor storage areas. So these are all certainly areas that we're going to cover, as well as the most popular looks like challenges, the indoor storage issues. And here's some examples of some of the most common chemicals in use. And these are chosen from, this is not an all-inclusive list, but it is chosen amongst thousands of chemicals that are in use in the workplace that are particularly more uncommon. One of the most common hazards of these chemicals is flammability, right? The center of our topic today. And to protect you and your employees, OSHA has developed some very detailed regulations covering the storage and use of chemicals. And so we can see up there things like gasoline, diesel fuel, maybe you're using paint or paint thinners, solvents, cleaning solutions, perhaps polishes, adhesives, or even hand sanitizer, especially with the pandemic and having hand sanitizers or what have you in your workplace. So we'll be covering that as well. So here's some key definitions that you should be mindful of that are also in 1910-106. And they're a little different than the DOT, the Department of Transportation's definitions, or even NFPA's definitions. And so I'll briefly touch on these as they'll come up through the webcast. So flashpoint is going to be the lowest temperature at which a liquid gives off a vapor in a concentration that's sufficient enough to form an ignitable mixture with the air near the surface of the liquid. And where are we finding that? We're finding that typically on your safety data sheet. And so as you're building your chemical inventory list, you'll have the associated SDSs, and that's primarily where you're getting that flash point. We'll be talking more about that. Boiling point's going to be the boiling point of your liquid at pressure of 14.7 pounds per square inch, absolute. And again, you're getting that boiling point information primarily from the safety data sheet as well. I can't stress enough how important it is as you're putting together or looking through your flammable liquids program in your workplace, having that chemical inventory list and the associated SDSs, so that way you can gauge which ones are going to be your flammable liquids. Also, you'll hear us talk about fire areas, so I threw this one in as well. And this is typically going to be, this is by OSHA definition. This is going to be a separate part of the building by construction where it's going to have a fire resistance of at least an hour, fire resistance rating. And this is primarily where I've seen the local fire codes come into play. So how that 1 hour fire resistance rating is achieved can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So it's pretty important to research those and know what those are.
All right, thank you, Ray. I'm going to jump in here. And again, thanks everyone for joining us to talk about flammable liquids. Some of you may still refer to flammable and combustible liquids, but and that's because OSHA used to call them that prior to aligning back in 2012 with the globally harmonized system. So if you remember that change, which changed your HAZCOM or hazard communication labels using the pictogram format, that also changed the way we classify flammable liquids. So with the adoption of GHS, OSHA simplified the definition by eliminating the term combustible and then substituting 4 flammable liquids categories. And those are based on a material's flash point and boiling point. And those are really important. They're addressed, the categories are referred to throughout the OSHA standard at 1910.106 to guide employers in the proper storage, handling, and use. Again, that's based on the specific category chemicals that are being dealt with. So when it comes to flammable liquids, there are 4 categories, and those are listed on your slide right now. So rather than go into detail about the temperature ranges for the categories, just note that the important information to know is the liquid's flash point. That's really key. And to illustrate just how important it is to understand the flash point and how to locate that information on a safety data sheet, we took an example from a testimony that was given by a hospital director. This would be for a U.S. Senate committee. So in the hospital's laboratory where this person worked, they had 2 gallons of a solvent that spilled on the floor. The employee who discovered the spill knew to look for the safety data sheet, but had difficulty locating the spill response section. She notified the hospital's engineering department and then began to clean up the spill with solid waste rags and placed those rags into a clear plastic bag for disposal. What she did not know is that this particular solvent had a flash point of 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So she walked the bag down to the incinerator room and left it there, which basically, as you can figure, created a live bomb that eventually detonated. 12 people ended up being treated for burns from that event. So, if the employee better understood the hazards of the chemical, she may have treated the spill differently. There are specially designed absorbent materials for that type of spill cleanup. You'll see them offered in pillows, pads, sheets, tubes, and other shapes to fit your different cleanup needs. Once that absorbent material is saturated, it should be placed in a sealed container, again, to control the vapor. Other spill cleanup alternatives are you can use special pumps or vacuum equipment that will do similar to the absorbents. So a relatively easy way to identify the hazards of the flammable liquids, like Ray alluded to earlier, is with your safety data sheets or your SDSs. The chemical manufacturer, or in some cases the importer or supplier, is required to provide certain information on that SDS so that downstream users have the knowledge necessary to safely work with the chemical. And on that SDS, there are 16 sections, and it's structured to begin with the information that is the most important to workers, followed by the more technical information. The sections that you and your employees will want to look at in particular for flammable liquids are Section 2, which identifies the hazards of a substance, and then Section 9, which identifies physical and chemical properties that are associated with the substance or mixture. This is where flash point, your upper and lower flammability or explosive limits, and initial boiling points and ranges will be listed. So very important. Other information that you can find on the SDS includes the product's hazardous ingredients, physical data associated with it, fire and explosion hazards, reactivity data, which is also important when you're dealing with flammables, conditions to avoid, and then special precautions, which oftentimes is storage and handling. Now, if you'd like unlimited access to safety data sheets, SDSs, and other chemical management resources. You can elect for complimentary access to J.J. Keller's Safety Management Suite. Within Safety Management Suite, there is a chemical center that delivers cutting-edge chemical management tools, allowing you to easily access your safety data sheets, as well as track, label, manage, and report on chemical hazards throughout your facility. If you use the poll to select your interests, and along with your access, you'll also receive our digital white paper, your guide to safe storage of flammable liquids in workplaces. So take a second there and select which option you'd prefer, and that will definitely help us out a lot. And with that, we'll jump back in here and look at some labeling requirements. One common misconception is that an employee will always know a flammable liquid by the container that it's in. We'd like to hope that's the case, but it's not always. Flammable liquids can come in all sorts of containers. You'll see aerosols, cans, drums, totes, portable tanks, even in tanker trucks or rail cars. So you can't really look at the design and construction of the container to determine whether or not a chemical meets the definition of a flammable liquid, nor will it help you determine the flammability category, which again is critical to proper handling and storage. OSHA's flammable liquid standards only requires the labeling of flammable storage cabinets. However, other OSHA standards do require you to label containers of hazardous substances. And that's primarily the OSHA HAZCOM standard. Here are some examples of labels that would be used on a drum. And we call this a single container label. OSHA allows you to use the GHS style labels, which are the pictogram type labels, or in-house labels like NFPA or HMIS style labels. And you can see those on the slide. In addition, the DOT or Department of Transportation calls for shipping labels to be placed on containers of flammable liquids that are shipped into your facility and put into inventory. The DOT's hazmat regulations apply to the exterior shipping container, while OSHA regulates the container that actually holds the hazardous chemical. So if you are, let's say, shipping a flammable liquid in a shipping container like a box with individual containers of hazardous chemicals inside, the shipping label on the exterior package would need to meet DOT hazmat labeling requirements, but then each workplace container of the flammable liquid inside the box would be labeled with an OSHA GHS compliant label. Now, in some cases, a single container of flammable liquids serves as both the shipping container and the container that holds the liquid, like drums or totes. In this case, you need both a DOT hazmat label and an OSHA GHS compliant label. OSHA and DOT have agreed that OSHA's GHS compliant label is allowed to be placed on the drum along with the DOT label. But where a pictogram required by DOT appears on the shipping container, the pictogram specified by OSHA for that same hazard would not need to appear, could not appear. That's prohibited.
All right, terrific. Good information, Travis. Thank you. And as I mentioned, we'll be getting into common questions that we see our clients have that come across their workplace. This here is are fire extinguishers required when you have the presence of flammable liquids? So generally, no, unless a particular standard says you need it. So in this case, we're dealing with flammable liquids. And so, yes, you would need it where flammable liquids are concerned. So we mentioned that the standard that we're following, right, is 1910 110. And if you look in paragraph D7, it requires suitable fire extinguishers where flammable liquids are being stored in your workplace. And this section is a general requirement. There's other sections that have specific requirements. So, for instance, if you're a bulk plant, maybe a service station, or you have other specialized situations, there's going to be specific requirements for that fire extinguisher. Things like what class, where you're going to place it, that kind of thing. You're going to need at least one portable fire extinguisher, and it needs to have a rating of no less than 12B units. AB rated fire extinguishers, they cover flammable liquids and gases, but not grease or cooking oils. And that 12B, so that 12, that basically means that the fire extinguisher can stop up to a 12 square feet area of a Class B fire. So again, that minimum requirement is a 12B unit. And the portable fire extinguisher, remember, should be placed outside of, but not more than 10 feet from the door into any room used for your flammable liquid storage. And I see a lot of places where they'll have the fire extinguisher, but it's not close enough to the storage area. So again, that trigger is 10 feet from the door of any room that you're storing those flammable liquids. And not less than 10 feet or more than 25 feet from any category 1, 2, or 3 flammable liquid storage area that is not in a storage room. So again, generally, if you have the flammable liquids, yes, you should have the fire extinguisher, but you're going to need to refer to the standard depending upon what your particular situation is going to be. So up here on the screen, you can see, I'll refer to this slide several times. We're going to get into, different types of scenarios that you might have in your workplace, whether it's indoor storage or outdoor storage. Maybe you're a retail outlet or an automotive service station, or perhaps you have a shipping and receiving or a warehouse where you're storing these flammable liquids. And we'll walk through what the requirements are going to be. All right. So first we'll talk a little bit about basements. We find that a lot of our clients have facilities that have some sort of substructure area, such as a basement where they're storing their flammable liquids. And so OSHA prohibits the storage of category 1, 2, and 3 flammable liquids in basements and only allows the protected storage of up to 5,500 gallons of the category 3 liquid in a basement area, or up to 8,250 gallons of a category 4 liquid in a basement area. And remember, when you see in the standard where they're talking about protected storage areas, this is going to be an area that has a sprinkler or a carbon dioxide or some sort of a fire protection system. And so if you have that, you're going to need to follow your local jurisdiction's building codes and fire codes to make sure that you're compliant with that local jurisdiction. All right, the next area here is, which is common, are clients that typically have an indoor storage area. And OSHA expects that all flammable liquids defined in 1910-106 will be stored in a flammable storage cabinet or inside of a storage room or a warehouse. And so we typically see those as the common scenarios, again, with our clients. And there's some expectations associated with these 3 areas that we'll be talking about in today's webcast.
I think we get more questions from clients on flammable storage cabinets than probably any other flammable liquid topic. So we do want to spend some time going over that issue with you. So flammable storage cabinets have to limit internal temperatures to 325 degrees during a 10-minute fire test. And during the test, the joints and seams must stay tight and the doors must remain closed. The cabinet must also be labeled flammable, keep fire away, and there are some limits on the amount of flammable liquids that can be stored in any one cabinet. And that would be no more than 60 gallons of category 1, 2, or 3, or 120 gallons of class 4. Category 4 liquids may be in a single storage cabinet. And yes, you can mix category 3 with category 1 and 2 flammable liquids, but you can only have 60 gallons total in a cabinet if you do that. Now, the NFPA standard, NFPA 30, prohibits storage of combustible materials near the cabinet. That standard also says that you may only have 3 cabinets in any one fire area unless that area is protected by sprinklers. And in that case, you're allowed to have up to 6. You might also keep smaller flammable liquids in their original containers in the cabinet. In other words, you do not have to remove them from their shipping boxes. We get that question quite a bit. And of course, OSHA always expects that your workplace will be kept clean and orderly, which generally would include removing things like combustibles, combustible residue, and so on from the area around your cabinets. Interestingly, though, OSHA does not address venting of flammable storage cabinets at all. Now, the NFPA 30 standard states that cabinets shall not be required to be vented for fire protection purposes, and vent openings shall be sealed. The standard also says that if the storage cabinet is vented, it must be vented direct to outdoors in such a manner that would not compromise the specified performance of the cabinet, and in a manner that would be acceptable to what is called the authority having jurisdiction, which typically would be your fire marshal or local fire authorities. Unless the cabinets are vented to the outside, the vent holes are to be left plugs. And yes, we have gotten calls from people who have just purchased a new flammable storage cabinet and who punched out the vent hole openings because, you know, that's what they thought they were supposed to do, but certainly not the case.
All right. Thanks, Travis. So another frequent question that we get are any exceptions? Are there any exceptions for storing flammable liquids outside of a flammable cabinet? And there is an exemption for particularly incidental storage that OSHA talks about in 1910-106. And this is in paragraph E2I. And this allows you to store up to 25 gallons of a category 1 and also up to 120 gallons of a category 2, 3, and 4 container in any fire area of your workplace facility. And if you remember, we kind of talked about what that fire area is earlier in the webcast, and that's going to be a separate area of your workplace, a particular area in the building that has that fire resistance of up to at least 1 hour. And this is important where your local fire and building codes typically will come into play on how to achieve that resistance. So for containers that are actively in use, you are allowed to keep 1 day's worth or 1 shift's worth of flammable liquid storage outside of protected storage. At the end of the day or at the end of the shift, the containers would have to be put back properly and stored correctly when they're not being used. And that is where your flammable storage cabinets will come into play that Travis just discussed to store those containers after you're done using them, again, at the end of the day or at the end of your shift. So even under incidental storage, right, you have to follow rules, in particular to when you're using your flammable liquids and also handling of them as well. So for example, flammables, you're going to have to keep them in closed containers when they're not being used. So you can't just leave them, leave the container open without a cover. You must clean up leaks and spills promptly. And so if you have a leak situation, you want to have resources available to address those. You also have to control your ignition sources, right? So you want to do things like post warning signs as needed. For example, you might have a no smoking sign where hazards from liquids are present because of ignitable vapors. Flammable liquids give off, so you may want to post those. And follow common sense rules, right, when dispensing from one container to another. Very important. Transfer of liquid, right, relies on dispensing methods. Transfer of flammable liquids refers to their removal from your storage area to places where you're going to be using them. And this is typically done in one of two ways. And Travis had mentioned this earlier. So you got the gravity flow for horizontally stored drums, or you could use your pump method for vertically stored drums. And you'll want to remember that for gravity flow, liquids must be dispensed using self-closing valves. Liquids should be dispensed into a safety can, and a drip should be placed under the valve to catch any spills that might occur. Also remember that the receiving container has to be bonded to the grounded drum to draw off any static electrical charge that might occur while you're transferring the liquid from container to container. Now, the other method, the pump method, basically empties the drum almost completely, and that's going to save space because the drums are stored vertically. So here's another common question that we get, whether or not you can stack your flammable storage cabinets. So this one is a unique one. My recommendation is that you check with your the particular cabinet that you buy. You check with the manufacturer. OSHA does not prohibit you from stacking your cabinets, but the agency would expect that you check with the manufacturer. There are many units that are available for purchase where they come already designed to be stacked on top of one another. A lot of them will have straps where you can secure them if they're up against a wall, or you can secure the units to each other. And so it really just depends upon which one you're buying and what your manufacturer allows you to do with your unit. Again, this is another checkpoint. Certainly check your local fire authority and building codes. There are more restrictive codes across the nation that don't allow you to store your flammable storage cabinets. So just make sure that you're up to speed on what that might be.
Let's look now at inside storage rooms. Those have to meet the requirements of 106, some of which you are shown to you here. And that includes self-closing fire doors, liquid-tight floor joints, fluid capture system, and so on. Another important component is ventilation to remove or reduce vapor buildup. And that will help keep an explosive atmosphere from developing either through gravity or mechanically to change air within the room, usually at least 6 times per hour. When it comes to allowable storage quantities in inside storage rooms, typically will be limited by the size of the room, by the fire protection that's provided, and by the fire resistance of the construction of the room. So allowable quantities will be given in total gallons per square foot of floor area. Every inside storage room needs to have an aisle that's at least 3 feet wide. And that's so that, easy movement within the room, it's necessary basically to reduce the potential for spilling or damaging the containers, and to provide both a ready escape path for occupants of the room should a fire occur, and then also access for firefighting. Containers over 30 gallons capacity cannot be stacked on top of one another inside the room. The standard also prohibits smoking or open flames in flammable or combustible liquid storage areas. That probably goes without saying, but OSHA does require that you post no smoking signs in service stations, filling areas, and bulk plants. Also, read the labels, the safety data sheets, or both before you store substances near or with flammable liquids. There are substances that can become unstable or explosive if they get mixed with flammable liquids. So you always want to follow the manufacturer's instructions when it comes to storage compatibility. Is grounding and bonding required for dispensing liquids? That's a very important question that we'll address over the next few slides. Short answer is that even if it isn't required by our regulations, it's always a best practice. So OSHA requires containers to be bonded and grounded when transferring Category 1 or 2 flammable liquids or Category 3 flammable liquids with a flash point below 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But unfortunately, OSHA doesn't explain how this must be done. But anyone who is familiar with electrical wiring shouldn't have a problem. Bonding might include use of a stranded or braided wire to prevent having a single wire strand fail. The wire doesn't have to be very large. It just equalizes the potential. A number 10 or 12 wire would work. Just has to be large enough for the mechanical fasteners to be attached. You can also use a clamp with hardened steel points to penetrate paint, rust, or other coating so that it makes to make contact with the metal of the containers. Now, if the container is plastic, you would use a metal spigot and connect the wire to that. Then you can place a metal lance or just the end of the wire placed into to the container being filled. You could also pour through a metal screen attached to the original container. So that's fairly typical bonding and grounding setup. The barrels have a wire which is attached to a grounding wire. There are suction pumps to draw from the barrel. And you can see on the slide there, the wire and clamp which is attached to the container being filled. So according to the OSHA requirement, only Class 1 liquids are required to be bonded and grounded. But for your own safety, bonding and grounding should always be used when dispensing flammable or combustible liquids. Many flammable liquids acquire a static charge when they're poured or transferred, and that static discharge is often enough to cause a fire under the right circumstances. Take low conductivity liquids, which present static ignition hazards, and those include toluene, xylene, hexane, heptane. Conductive liquids like alcohol can pick up a charge inductively from a plastic container that is charged. And in real life, a static charge in the chemical, along with failure to properly bond and ground, can have some really severe catastrophic effects. OSHA's hazardous materials course tells us that OSHA doesn't require flammable storage cabinets to be grounded, but that NFPA 77, the static electrical standard, does. Also, NFPA 30 requires that all metal parts on or near the place where flammable liquids are transferred must be grounded. Your state or local fire codes may require flammable storage cabinets be grounded, so you should definitely check with those, and also check with your liability insurance carrier. It's possible that they could have a requirement as well, and of course, failure to do that could affect your insurance rates.
All right. Getting into some more specific storage areas that you may have in your workplace. This one here is talking about office storage in particular. So if you look at in 106 paragraph D53, limits the storage of flammable liquids in office settings to basically amounts that are just required for maintenance and operation of equipment. It's important to note that flammable liquid storage should not be located in such a way where if there was a fire, that it would make it difficult to escape the building. So, particularly you wouldn't want to store near something like a stairway or exit doors, where if there was a fire, occupants wouldn't be able to escape efficiently. Another question that we typically get, especially with the pandemic, is whether or not you can store hand sanitizer in offices. So with many employers storing greater amounts of hand sanitizer, again, because of the COVID-19 situation, we've been asked for guidance on this. So first, if you have a personal sized hand sanitizer, kind of like the one shown up there on the slide, this shouldn't be an issue. But when we get asked questions, typically clients are thinking about drum size containers of hand sanitizer, in particular to refilling these small containers that you may have in your offices. And remember that the standard is talking about, in particular, near offices, that we're only storing what's needed to perform basic maintenance. So something like a drum-sized container, you wouldn't be allowed to store that near the office. That more appropriate place would be something like a flammable storage warehouse or an inside storage room that's been built appropriately according to the standard, but certainly not near your office spaces. So now this is another question that we get about whether or not a particular container is approved container. So using improper containers, right, to store flammable liquids can be a fire hazard. So when a container fails and the flammable liquid inside of it is spilled, vapors begin to form immediately. And it's the vapors that are going to ignite, and they pose the greatest danger to workers, right? So flammable liquids must be stored in closed containers, as we talked about, or tanks when they're not in use. Only approved containers and portable tanks should be used. Metal containers meeting the DOT's requirements fit the bill, right? Those will work, for example. It's also really important to consider that when you're placing these containers, that they're not located near those exits and under stairways, as I was talking about, because it can prevent efficient escape from the building in the event that there was a fire situation. Another common question that we get is concerning whether or not you can have a plastic gas can. So technically, a plastic gas can doesn't meet the requirements for a flammable liquid container. However, right, OSHA has a letters of interpretation that's out there dated August 26th, 1996, and it states that under certain conditions, the use of a plastic fuel can would be considered a de minimis violation. And that basically means that It's technically a violation of the OSHA standard 106, but it isn't given a fine. And what OSHA says is that if you do use a plastic gas can, typically you want to have three conditions met. It's a gas can that's 5 gallons or less in capacity. It needs to be approved by the DOT, Department of Transportation, or some other nationally recognized testing laboratory. And it's properly labeled, right? We've talked about some labeling requirements Travis did earlier, and those labeling requirements are found in 1910, 1200, and so it needs to be properly labeled. The standard has a requirement for safety cans. We had talked about, primary means and methods for storage being your inside rooms, your cabinets, and now safety cans. So safety cans are approved containers that hold 5 gallons or less. They have a spring closing lid and a sprout cover, which will basically relieve any internal pressure that is created if the safety can is subjected to a fire situation. A safety can doesn't have to be equipped with a flame arresting screen in the spout, although some testing laboratories will not label and list the container without one. And so you frequently will see them in there when you buy the manufactured containers from stores. So safety cans must be read, and that's required by 1910-144, and it must be properly labeled as required by the HAZCOM standard, as we talked about earlier.
All right, we are heading to the home stretch here, but not before we talk about aerosol cans. We get quite a few questions on those in terms of how do I store them, and is there an exemption for places like hardware stores? So first, OSHA differentiates between workplaces where containers of flammable liquids are opened and used. They differentiate that between mercantile and retail operations where the materials are only stored and handled but not used. If you look under, there's a section of the standard, paragraph A23, defines mercantile occupancy as an occupancy or use of a building or structure or any portion basically used for displaying, selling, or buying goods or merchandise. So in those types of areas, the flammable products for sale essentially have become what's called a consumer goods product. They're not being stored like you would in a warehouse or used like you would in a workplace setting. It's simply being displayed and sold for commerce purposes. So another part of the standard in paragraph D says mercantile occupancies and other retail stores, but does not discuss anything about inside storage requirements. That is because there is a retail exemption that does extend to those occupancy areas. So that's why you generally don't see OSHA compliance officers walking up and down the aisles of stores issuing citations. This also does not mean that an employer can store flammable liquids purposely in mercantile areas to avoid, the application of the standard. Again, though, those liquids would be used in areas that were exclusively used to display and sell consumer goods in small quantities. And there are some other exemptions in the standard too. For example, there are container exemptions for medicines, beverages, foodstuffs, cosmetics, as long as they're packaged according to commonly accepted practices. They can be exempt from some of the requirements in the flammable liquid standard. Same thing with flammable paints, oils, varnishes, and similar mixtures used for painting or maintenance when not kept for more than 30 days. Those have some exemptions, which are also located in paragraph D of the standard. But for flammable liquids in general, there are many OSHA regulations that could apply, including one called Process Safety Management, PSM. if you meet the threshold, which is 10,000 pounds or more of any flammable liquid. The requirements of 1910-125, if you have dipping and coating operations that use flammable liquids, and certainly the requirements of the IWASH standard at 1910.151C, if any of your flammable liquids are also corrosive. And we've already discussed really how HAZCOM's labeling and safety data sheets come into play. So there is a little bit more to it than just becoming familiar with 1910-106, but that definitely is generally the primary standard that you'd use along with NFPA, again, unless one of these more specific standards apply. And to wrap up today's discussion, you should also know that when dealing with flammable liquids, in addition to complying with the OSHA requirements, you must also satisfy the EPA or Environmental Protection Agency if you collect, store, and dispose of waste materials. We talked about the Department of Transportation, DOT, if you're shipping or if you carry flammable combustible liquids on your vehicles. Fire codes, which could be either state or local, like the International Fire Code or some NFPA codes. Your local authorities that have jurisdiction, which typically would be your fire marshal or local fire department, since they are typically the ones who will be, doing your fire inspections and enforcing the local fire codes. So you have OSHA enforcing their standards, but state and local fire officials will also conduct separate inspections and enforce your local fire codes. And then you have your liability insurance carrier, who may have requirements on, how and where you store flammable and combustible liquids, and they might limit the quantities that you have on hand. And that often comes down to the type of construction you have, type of the use, as well as whether you have sprinklers or not. So there's a lot of variables there, but definitely you have to consider a little bit more than OSHA when it comes to flammable liquids.
All right, terrific. We're going to get to your questions here in a moment. So if you haven't sent your question our way, you can go ahead and do that. But first, I wanted to address a few inquiries that have come in regarding the J.J. Keller Safety Management Suite. Again, today we're offering complimentary access to hundreds of award-winning training programs and thousands of customizable training resources. And these are going to include things like PowerPoints, presentations, 5-minute safety talks, classroom exercises, quizzes, and much more. In addition, you can create customized safety plans for your workplace. You can also ask our in-house experts and subject matter experts questions and much, much more. If you'd like free access to all of our compliance tools and resources in Safety Management Suite, use the poll to select your interests, and I'll put that up here shortly. And again, we'll also send you our white paper, as Travis had mentioned, your guide to safe storage of flammable liquids in the workplace. And with that, let's get to your very important questions. So a good question came in asking if we could repeat the incidental storage exemption quantities. And so again, if it's 25 gallons for category 1 flammables, and it's 120 gallons for your category 2, 3, and 4. So 25 for 1 and 120 for 2, 3, and 4. All right, let's some good questions here. So another one, we discussed safety cans versus plastic gas cans. What are the difference between the safety can and having the plastic one? So with the safety can, it's going to come with some extra features, right? It could have the flame arrestor. It's going to have the self-closing lid. It's going to have some sort of pressure relief capability that might be more durable and advanced than just what you can find on your typical plastic gas can. And with the flame arrestor, if that's a part of the one that you have, that's basically going to be just a screen that prevents the gas from exploding. All right. So
Yeah, I
if you're
have
in a
one here.
situation also, yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
Yeah. Someone's asking another question we get a little bit. Are flammable storage cabinets considered to be secondary containment? You're probably looking at EPA when you're talking secondary containment, assuming, you're referring to keeping it out of the drains and ultimately streams. But the OSHA standard in general really doesn't provide much information at all, particularly about storage cabinets. But I think if you check with the design, the majority of those that meet the NFPA requirements for storage cabinets have, maybe a 2-inch sump in the bottom that's used to catch some quantities of liquid. You might also, depending on how much you have, you certainly, like Ray talked about earlier, you can have additional spill control absorbent pads or pigs, those types of things around as well. So it's kind of going to depend a little bit on the design of your cabinet and how much you have in there. But generally EPA and OSHA both are pretty vague on exactly. There's a lot of different ways you can have secondary containment. So there's more than one.
All right. Also, just some points, there's a couple of questions on incompatible materials. So if you have an incompatible material and you have a storage situation where you have the flammable liquid, if you're storing certain chemicals together, it can create an adverse reaction. So if you had a scenario where maybe the container was leaking and it came in contact with the other chemical that is incompatible, it can create an adverse reaction. It could be a fire, it could be production of vapor, and it really just depends. And so what I recommend there is there's going to be your safety data sheet, but there's also going to be a product sheet that comes with your chemicals. And this is coming direct from the manufacturer, where they're really specifying in more detail about, well, how is it incompatible? Also look at the storage section on the SDS. It'll talk about how to store it, where to store it. But that's what you're trying to prevent, is those situations where you have a leak and two chemicals coming in contact with one another. And it could be a whole variety of different types of things. I mean, maybe you have a situation where a chemical adversely reacts to water, or some sort of an acid, a base, maybe a salt. Maybe you're storing absorption powders or oxidizing powders, even compressed gases. So it really depends upon what you might have in your storage situation and whether or not something is going to be incompatible with that. All right. Quick question came up here about the FSC, Federal Supply Classification. So if you're a contractor or your organization falls under the FSC, and we didn't really get into the details of this, the flammable solid storage, but here in particular, you're going to want to have a Class 4 dangerous goods storage cabinet. So the FSC requires that Class 4. And the stringency, or what you're going to be looking for, is the standard of AS 5026. And that's going to line out all the particulars that you're going to have for that storage cabinet. All right.
I've got one more here, Ray.
Sure.
Asking whether you can store flammable liquids along routes of egress. Generally, the answer to that is no. If you look at storage inside of a building, any type of flammable liquid, like even stock for sale, is not allowed to be stored so as to limit the use of exits. Also applies to stairways or any areas really that are normally used for egress of the occupants.
All right, terrific. Thank you, everybody, for attending today's webcast and for your questions. Looks like we're out of time, unfortunately, and I'll turn things back over to Jess.
Thank you, Ray and Travis, for a great presentation. I do want to thank our attendees as well. This was a very engaged audience. If your question wasn't answered live today, the speakers or a member of their team will try to follow up with you as soon as possible. If you are watching this on demand, please feel free to submit questions as well before you close out. Any questions submitted on demand will be forwarded to the appropriate team members. Thank you again for joining us today. And at this point, we're going to conclude today's webinar, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the day.